My brother showed up at my front door on a Wednesday afternoon in February with a 9-year-old girl, a duffel bag that barely held 3 days of clothes, and the expression I had spent 32 years to read. That expression meant he had already decided something and just needed me to go along without asking too many questions. The sleet coming off Halifax Harbor was the sideways kind, the sort that cuts right through your jacket no matter how good it is, but he didn't step inside. He set the duffel bag down on my porch mat, patted the girl on top of her toque once, and handed me a folded piece of paper with his email address scrawled on it. "Just a few days," he said, with a brightness that didn't reach his eyes. "Serena and I have some things to sort out in Alberta. Cora's been a bit clingy lately, and we thought she'd do better with family." He said the word family the way some people say convenient. I looked down at the little girl standing beside him. She was small for 9, wearing a puffy pink jacket, with a broken zipper that flapped open in the wind, and she was clutching a spiral-bound notebook against her chest so tightly that her knuckles had gone white through her mittens. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for her mum. She was just watching my brother's face with a particular stillness. The kind you only see in children, who have already figured out that making noise doesn't change anything. "Call if you need anything," my brother said. And then he jogged back to his truck, which had Alberta plates on it that I was only now noticing, and pulled away through the sleet without looking back. I stood in the doorway for a moment after his taillights disappeared. Not alarmed yet. Just that feeling you get right before the weather turns. A low, slow unease, as though the air is holding its breath. My name is Nina. I'm 32 years old, and up until that Wednesday, the most complicated thing in my week was reconciling quarterly invoices for a handful of small businesses. I do bookkeeping for out of my home office in Dartmouth. I like spreadsheets. I like the radio on low in the background. I like the view of the harbor from my kitchen window in the mornings, especially in winter, when the light comes in flat and gray and everything looks clean. I am not someone who expects her life to become the kind of story that other people look at sideways when you tell it. I brought her inside, got her settled at the kitchen table with her boots off and her jacket hung up. Made her a mug of hot chocolate the way I used to like it when I was small. A little extra milk so it wasn't too hot. One marshmallow dropped in at the end. She held the mug in both hands and kept the notebook on the table right beside her elbow the whole time, as though she was afraid someone might take it the moment she set it down. I sat across from her and tried to keep my voice easy. "Can you tell me about that?" I asked, nodding toward the notebook. She looked at me, not suspicious exactly, more like she was doing some quiet internal calculation. "My dad wrote in it," she said. "Before he got really sick. He told me to keep it somewhere safe and not let Mum find it." She slid it across the table toward me, both hands staying on it for a moment before she let go. "There's something inside you should probably see." Her father's name was Paul. He had died 18 months earlier from pancreatic cancer, leaving behind his daughter, his former house, his savings, and a life insurance payout. He had also left behind this notebook, filled mostly with letters to Cora. Things he wanted her to remember about him, things he wanted her to know about herself. Notes that grew more fragmented and emotional toward the back as his handwriting got shakier. Near the very end, tucked between 2 pages and folded into quarters, was a printed email. It was from a client services officer at Scotia Trust, sent to Paul's personal address about 15 months ago, roughly 3 months before he died. He had printed it out and put it here on purpose. I smoothed it flat on the table and read it twice, very carefully, because I am a bookkeeper, and reading financial documents carefully is something I do reflexively. What the email confirmed was this: Paul had established a formal trust through Scotia Trust for Cora. Everything he had, proceeds from selling the house in Eastern Passage, the life insurance payout, his savings, had been transferred into the trust. The total was just over $340,000. Scotia Trust was named as the corporate trustee, which meant they held the authority to approve or deny any significant movement of funds. Serena had been named as a secondary trustee, which gave her authority to request disbursements for Cora's day-to-day care, school fees, medical needs. But she could not move principal funds, and she certainly could not dissolve the trust, without Scotia Trust's sign-off at every step. And then I saw Paul's handwriting in the margin at the bottom of the printed email. Uneven, clearly written, when his hands were already struggling. 8 words. If they remove Scotia Trust, the money is gone. I set the paper down on the table. My hot chocolate had gone cold. Your mum, I said carefully. I kept my voice level. And my brother. Do you know if they made any changes recently to how your dad's trust is being handled? Cora thought about it. Mum said the people at the bank were too difficult, she said. She said she found someone better. After that, she bought a new car. I got up and poured myself a glass of water that I didn't actually want, just to have something to do for 30 seconds while my thoughts arranged themselves. Because here's what I know from 8 years of reading financial records for a living. Removing the corporate trustee from a minor's trust fund without court approval or solid legal grounds is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is the single act that makes everything else possible. Once Scotia Trust was out of the picture, there was no approval process. There was no oversight. There was nothing between my brother and $340,000 that belonged to this child. I went back to the table. I asked Cora if she wanted to watch something on the TV in the living room, and she nodded and took her hot chocolate with her. And the moment she was out of the kitchen, I opened my laptop and called my friend Denise, who has worked as a paralegal in Halifax for 11 years. I talked fast. I gave her the short version. There was a pause on her end, and then she said, Nina, you need a family law solicitor tonight, not tomorrow morning. Tonight. Call Rebecca Osei. She handles trust fraud specifically, and she's good. I had never heard of Rebecca Osei. Denise texted me the number before I'd finished saying thank you, and I dialed immediately. Rebecca Osei answered herself. She was calm and precise, and she asked me to photograph the email and anything else I had and send it over before she said anything more. I photographed the letter, photographed the relevant pages of Paul's notebook, and emailed everything within 8 minutes. She called me back in 20. When did they leave for Alberta? She asked. That was her first question. About 4 hours ago, I said. Then we have approximately 60 hours, she said. My office received a routine notification today. Your brother filed an annual accounting report with the Nova Scotia Public Trustee's Office on behalf of the trust this morning. Under provincial regulations, if that report goes unchallenged within 72 hours of filing, the current trustee receives automatic confirmation of her status. That confirmation would make any subsequent fund transfers significantly harder to reverse. The window closes Friday at noon. I looked at the clock on my microwave. Wednesday, 6:49 in the evening. What do we need? I asked. Everything you can find, she said. Bank records, correspondence, anything showing the removal of the corporate trustee and any transfers since. I'll start the IBS emergency application for account records from Scotia Trust tonight. And Nina, do not let them know anything has changed. If they realize you've filed, they will accelerate whatever they're planning. Can you keep that up? I told her I could. We hung up. My brother texted me 40 minutes later. Cora behaving? I stared at the message for a moment. Then I typed back, she's wonderful. We made hot chocolate. Have a safe trip. He sent a thumbs up emoji, nothing else. I put the phone face down on the counter and went back to the kitchen table, and I worked. There is something clarifying about being given 60 hours and a clear objective. I have spent years doing this, finding the pattern in numbers, tracking where money goes, identifying the moment when the ledger stops adding up. I'd just never expected to be doing it for this reason, about these people, at my own kitchen table, in the middle of a February night, while a 9-year-old slept down the hall. Rebecca's emergency application to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia's Probate Division came through by Thursday morning. The documents from Scotia Trust followed by late afternoon, and what they showed was methodical and devastating. The corporate trustee had been removed 11 months ago through a legal application supported by a letter supposedly signed by Paul. Rebecca identified the forgery within 20 minutes of receiving the document. Every legitimate signature Paul had ever put on file with Scotia Trust, and there were 12 of them, used his initials and surname. The fabricated letter used his full legal name, written out in block letters. Someone had looked at Paul's real signatures, hadn't looked closely enough, and made a mistake that a careful reader catches immediately. In the 11 months since Scotia Trust was removed, $63,000 had moved out of the trust in a series of transfers, each one carefully sized to fall just below the amounts that would trigger automatic review. $14,000 here, $9,000 there. A few smaller ones scattered through the months to keep the pattern irregular. Some of it went to a joint personal account. Some went to a line of credit in my brother's name. And $22,000 had gone, in one transfer 4 months ago, to a numbered company registered in Alberta. I found my brother's social media that evening. He had forgotten I was still connected to it. There was a photograph from 2 days ago. Him and Serena at a restaurant in Calgary. A nice one by the look of the room behind them, the two of them raising glasses at the camera. The caption said "New Chapter" with a little star emoji. I took screenshots and emailed them to Rebecca at 11:15 at night. Cora helped me on Thursday afternoon, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with the original trust documents spread between us. She was calm in a way that made my chest ache. 9 years old, and she sat there pointing at her father's real signatures versus the copied one with a quiet certainty that belonged to someone much older. "Dad always put a little loop at the end," she said, tracing a real signature with her fingertip without touching the paper. "This one doesn't have it." She said it like a fact, not a revelation, and I had to take a breath before I answered her. By Thursday evening, Rebecca had filed our emergency objection with the Public Trustee's office and a petition for an urgent review hearing the following morning. The trust accounts were provisionally flagged. The accounts weren't frozen yet. That would depend on the hearing. But any large transfer attempt would now trigger an immediate hold. My brother texted again Thursday night. "Everything okay?" "Completely fine," I wrote back. "She's already asleep. Safe travels." 3 thumbs ups this time. I didn't sleep much. Friday morning, I dressed Cora in the nicest thing in her duffel bag, which was a soft blue sweater with a small moose embroidered on the collar. She told me without much preamble that her dad had given it to her, and she'd been saving it. I did her hair, made oatmeal with brown sugar and a small pile of blueberries on top because that was what she asked for. And then I drove us across the bridge into Halifax in the Friday's sleet. The Public Trustee's office on Hollis Street is a beige government building with fluorescent overhead lighting and a row of vinyl chairs in the waiting area. It doesn't look like the setting for the most important morning of your life, but there we were. Rebecca Ossie was already inside. She was taller than I'd imagined from her voice, with a briefcase that turned out to hold just over 300 pages of documentation. She shook my hand and crouched down briefly to introduce herself to Cora, who regarded her for a moment and then gave a small nod that seemed to settle something between them. Miss Theriot, the reviewing officer assigned to the hearing, called us in at 9:15. And then the front entrance opened and my brother walked in. He'd driven straight through from Calgary. 10 hours. He'd apparently been watching Cora's location through a shared family app on an iPad he'd left in the duffel bag, and he'd seen the Hollis Street location tag that morning and understood, finally, that something had collapsed beneath him. He came in loud. He said words like misunderstanding and family matter and overreaction, and his voice bounced off the vinyl flooring and the drop ceiling in a way that made the receptionist look up sharply. He talked about how I had always been dramatic, how he and Serena were the rightful administrators, how this was none of the government's business, how he was going to have his solicitor on the phone within the hour. I let him finish. Miss Theriot waited until the room went quiet. Then she looked at Rebecca, and Rebecca stood up, opened the briefcase, and began. The forged signature, the 11-month timeline of transfers, the numbered Alberta company, the Calgary restaurant photograph posted 2 days ago by a man who had told me he was on an innocent business trip, the Scotia Trust records showing $63,000 moved in careful increments, the original trust doc showing $340,000 protected for a child. Paul's printed email. Paul's 8 words in the margin, and Cora's account of her mother saying the bank people were too difficult. Delivered in the calm, precise voice of a girl who had decided to tell the truth even though it cost her something to do it. My brother went pale somewhere around the 3rd document Rebecca laid on the table. By the 7th, he'd sat down. He tried then to reframe himself as someone who hadn't known. He said Serena had managed the estate paperwork, and he hadn't been closely involved. He said he'd trusted her to handle the legal side. He said this in 3 slightly different versions in the space of about 2 minutes, and each version sounded more like a calculation than a confession. Miss Theriot raised her hand and he stopped talking. In a quiet final voice, she explained that the trust accounts were being frozen effective, immediately pending a full forensic review. The matter was being referred to the RCMP's Commercial Crime Section. There was a provisional order removing Serena as trustee, effective immediately, with an independent trust company being appointed in her place. She asked my brother to remain available to investigators and to surrender his passport to the attending officer who had been called in. My brother stood up. He looked at me across the table, really looked at me, for the first time since he'd left Cora on my porch, and I held his gaze. There was something moving through his expression that I couldn't quite name and didn't particularly want to. Then he walked out of the room without saying anything, and I heard the front entrance close behind him. Cora had sat beside me through the entire hearing without making a sound. When the room finally went quiet, she slid her small hand over mine on the table, and I had to tip my head back and look at the ceiling for a moment before I trusted myself to speak. The weeks after the hearing moved slowly, and then all at once, the way difficult things sometimes do. The RCMP opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. My brother and Serena returned to Halifax by the end of that first week. Their accounts were frozen. The numbered Alberta company had been flagged for a parallel audit, and there was nowhere particularly comfortable to be in Calgary either. They retained separate solicitors and stopped speaking to each other except through formal legal correspondence, which is, I'm told, a common development in situations like theirs. The trust review confirmed everything Rebecca had found and then some. The forensic accountant, the court-appointed uncovered documentation, suggesting that my brother and Serena had been planning the full liquidation of the trust for well over a year, waiting for a reporting window when the oversight would be thinnest. They had looked at Paul's careful planning, all those months of paperwork and phone calls while he was sick, trying to make sure his daughter would be protected. And they had reverse-engineered it into a roadmap for taking everything. $277,000 remained in the trust when the accounts were frozen. The court transferred management to one of the established trust companies in Halifax, with full auditing, 6 months, and a provincial review every 6 months until Cora turns 19. Rebecca told me, when it was all finalized, that the structure was about as airtight as it could be, every cent of it accounted for, secured, and out of reach of anyone who didn't have Cora's best interest as their only concern. Because Serena's fitness as a legal guardian was under active review, given the criminal investigation, the court asked, through Rebecca, who would take temporary custody of Cora. I thought about that first morning on my porch. The broken zipper on the pink jacket. The way she'd held the notebook before she trusted me with it. The quiet, careful voice saying Dad never wrote the P that way. I said yes before Rebecca had finished the question. Cora's duffel bag isn't sitting by the front door anymore. Her blue moose sweater hangs on the hook in the hallway, the one that used to hold my gym bag, which I moved to the closet to make room. She has a drawer in the bathroom for her things and a library book on my coffee table. She goes through them fast, 2 or 3 a week, and I've started putting holds on things I think she'd like before she asks. Her homework schedule is stuck to the fridge with a Peggy's Cove magnet I bought years ago on a solo day trip I barely remember now. She's back at her school, the same one she'd been in before everything fell apart, and her teacher called me 2 weeks ago to say she'd had a really good day, the best in a while, and had she mentioned the science project? She hadn't, but I'd found the Bristol board and the markers already laid out on the kitchen table when I came home that afternoon. She still carries the spiral notebook sometimes. I don't ask her about it. My brother and I have not spoken since the morning of the hearing. I don't know yet what the right amount of time is before I know what I want to say to him. I'm not sure I'm supposed to know yet. What I know is that Paul spent months during the worst year of his life setting up a structure to protect his daughter. And he put a note in the margin of a printed email because he was afraid something like this might happen. And he was right to be afraid, and I found it. That has to be enough for now. And some days, when Cora laughs at something on the television loud enough that I can hear it from my office, it is more than enough. I think about what I would tell someone who found themselves in a moment like mine. Evidence in one hand, a child looking at them from across a kitchen table, and a decision to make. I think the answer is simpler than it feels in the moment. You already know what to do. The hard part is just doing it anyway. What would you have done if you found out someone in your own family had been quietly taking apart a child's future, piece by piece? Would you have stayed out of it? Or would you have fought back? I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. Leave a comment below, because this one I want to talk about.